How to Be an Artist. Step 28, The Mind and Everything Else. With guest, Jason Snyder. All right, Jason Snyder, thank you for being with me here on How to Be an Artist.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. So I'm trying to frame why it is I want to have you on the podcast. Because I wasn't totally sure myself. I mean, I follow you on Twitter and you're always saying interesting things. And it seems like you have a wide array of areas that you're interested in and exploring. And so it's kind of interesting just to be exposed to all these different things as you're kind of studying stuff and figuring it out. But I think in general, the stuff that I connect with, if I'm trying to kind of frame where my interest is, I like that you're thinking about things. I don't know the word you'd use to describe this, but from all the way from the inside, all the way to the outside, as far as you're a meditator, you're a person that does contemplative work, but also then connecting that to okay, so how does that connect to the work I do? And how does that connect to the larger community? And all the way on out to the stars, is that fairly accurate way to describe things?
Yeah. I think it is pretty accurate. I have evolved for it to be kind of more coherent. I don't think it was always coherent, but it seems to have worked out that way, which is nice.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm a little bit of a lapsed meditator these days as well. I've kind of gotten out of practice. I need to get back in. So just as a caveat. But so I mean, I started. You mentioned before we started recording that you resonate with the pragmatic Dharma, and that's really when I first got on Twitter or started getting active on Twitter, in 2017, 18.
Okay,
that was a community that I really connected with as well, and I was really really influenced by folks like Daniel Ingram and Kenneth Folk, Vince Horn, other people in the pragmatic Dharma movement, as well as kind of the Advaita Vedanta, self-inquiry type community. And, it was really hardcore for a while, at least, hardcore for me, I wasn't a monk or anything. But it was still kind of, I would say, compartmentalized in my life at that time.
Interesting.
I was finishing my PhD, going into my postdoc, and, I wasn't particularly happy with how my career was going. I was kind of becoming disenchanted with it. And so for me, and I was also kind of having some interesting kind of psychological dissonance, cognitive dissonance, you could say. I think it comes from just, modernity in general and things not being connected, not being rooted. And so I started out pretty compartmentalized, I would say. And so that was just kind of my kind of escape hatch in a way,
And what was your interest into? What was your entry into pragmatic Dharma in the first place?
So I was into meditation as a teenager. I read Be Here Now by Ram Dass, was really influenced by that. And then I was meditating for a while, had some interesting experiences. And then I kind of got out of it for a while, became, a pretty serious Baha'i, member of the Baha'i faith. And then fell out of that. And then went through kind of a, I would say quasi-nihilist or, phase. And then somebody actually, kind of embarrassed to admit this, but somebody sent me an Eckhart Tolle book.
Okay. Hey man, nothing wrong about that.
Yeah.
So that's some good stuff there.
And, I started reading Eckhart Tolle and it just started resonating because I think for a while I was trying to think my way out of my emotional challenges and psychological challenges and just this kind of prompt to kind of be present in the moment was, I just resonated with it right away and I could just feel it. And then, I quickly wanted to get more kind of systematic kind of presentation because there's some kind of woo stuff, that Eckhart Tolle deals in that I was kind of I don't know if I buy that stuff. And so then I come across Shinzen Young's work, got really interested in his system, as well as Daniel Ingram at that time. And then I just really was just for probably a year and a half, just pretty obsessively researching different kind of systems, trying
Hmm.
different systems, and eventually kind of developed my own system, which kind of brings together various parts. And yeah, and so going back to your original question about how it kind of connects to my life, the way I think about it now is that one thing I discovered through meditation, becoming aware of my mind is this notion of embodied cognition. And
Okay.
I became, because I just noticed how much intelligence is stored in the body. uh, and then I heard about embodied cognition, and then I heard about like enactivism. So I started reading some of the enactivism literature. Mind in Life by Evan Thompson was really influential for me.
Okay.
um, and in retrospect, that naturally connects to situational cognition, and
So you may need
being,
to, could we pause a second, and
yeah,
could you go a little bit more into embodied cognition and that, and how that, I kind of what that means? I've heard that. I kind of feel like I have an intuition of what it means, but
yeah.
maybe you can explain it a little bit more just so I know
Well,
I'm on.
intuition is one good way to describe it.
Okay.
Right? It's kind
Yeah.
of like, I would say, non like so one kind of intelligence is kind of propositional intelligence,
Hmm.
um, you know, following a strain of logic. But another one is just you're driving down the street and you're not really overly thinking about it. It's just kind of happening, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's just because you've done it before, and it's just kind of been integrated into your body mind system.
Hmm.
Um, you know, Similarly, when oftentimes when we have like some kind of intense emotion, you have a couple options. One is you can kind of think about it a lot, and your
Hmm.
mind, at least my mind, just spins in circles.
Hmm.
Or you can feel into the body and notice what parts of the body are kind of lighting up. So it's like, okay, I feel really sad. Where can I actually feel that in the body, right? And normally you can actually physically locate it somewhere. And that's really interesting. And then once you place your attention on it, it starts to change, right? It might, the energy might shift, contract. Some things might, kind of decontract a little bit, and so that's very interesting. So I became very interested in these connections between the mind and the body,
Hmm.
essentially. And so I'd say embodied cognition is, kind of, I think intuition is one way that I think about it. It's kind of a kind of knowing, a knowingness. I would say that is not necessarily tied to a strain of propositional logic. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and in particular, knowing in the context of an environment. So, people who work with their hands,
Hmm.
I would say like carpenters, mechanics, like they have a lot of embodied cognition when it comes to those tasks because again, they're after a while it just kind of becomes automatic, right? Like
Hmm.
they don't have to really think about it. Like they just know what to do, and if they run into a new problem, their intuition generally serves them pretty well. So that's that I guess that's how I would describe embodied cognition. And situational cognition is kind of the extension of that into your immediate environment and in the ways in which we kind of co-evolve with our environment. Our
Hmm.
environment influences and shapes us, but we also influence and shape our environment. We create our own kind of little niche that creates this kind of feedback loop. Um, and and so um, and so that naturally leads to, I mean, in between there, in between here, I got interested in other ideas, metamodernism, et cetera. And that's a
Sure.
whole other
Yeah.
path.
Yeah.
That was tied to the Both And podcast as well. But it naturally leads to, I think, what resonated with me about uh, like localism, bioregionalism is that, rediscovering a sense of place, and how
Yeah.
that's tied to like planetary boundaries and, more ecological living. And so just being more intimate with your place, with your sense of place. And
And when you say that, your sense of place, you're talking about in very like direct, like
yeah,
literally the exact place where you are, the room you're in, or the stuff that you're interfacing directly with your body and your mind, right?
yeah, exactly. So I've been, we're starting up a kind of a homestead here. We've been doing it for about a year. And, like after a while, I mean, this is more theoretical at this point. I'm getting glimpses of it.
Mm-hmm.
But after a while, you start to have intuition about your environment. And it's like, okay, like I'm going to plant this here instead of here, or, I'm going to arrange this way instead of that way. And, of course, it's overlaid with a lot of theory. I'm also really interested in like permaculture, things like that. So those principles are there. But the idea is that over time, you develop kind of a really robust relationship with your environment where, you like it becomes more, I guess you can say, optimized.
Yes.
But
Okay. Yeah.
not in the sense of like optimizing for productivity, but kind of just optimizing for kind of whole system health, I guess you
Yeah.
could say. And of course, we hear a lot of these are anecdotal, and it might not apply generally, but we hear about indigenous cultures that were much more in touch with the land, right, and the season,
Yes. Yes.
and were foragers, for example, and knew which plants had a much greater understanding of like which plants were used for what and what affordances those created. And so this language of affordances or affordance I really like the more you know about your environment, the more affordances you have to creatively work with the environment. And so that
Interesting.
requires a kind of an intimate knowledge of it. And so in retrospect, going back, this transition towards from being my PhD was economics, applied economics. I
Did
was
you
getting
kind of,
trained.
your focus was kind of like in Africa too? Is that where you've mostly looked?
Yeah,
Like agriculture in Africa? Is that
yeah,
what?
like food systems in
Okay.
Africa. And so I was basically trained to be a technocrat, to do research, to write research reports on how different regions in Africa and maybe other parts of the world should develop, right?
Hmm.
And I think this transition, this wormhole that I went through, kind of led me to reject that paradigm a little bit.
Sure.
And now I'm much more, I also resonated with, like frameworks like complexity science, of the importance of evolutionary processes, of kind of bottom up processes.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of in tension with a technocratic kind of approach to things.
Where you're
Um,
like a distant expert
yeah,
trying to
yeah,
solve problems when you don't have that feedback of like being
yeah,
there and working directly with things. Yeah.
right. Um, yeah. So now I reflect pretty often like how integrated things feel, and it's like, okay, everything is kind of clicking together, and I'm no longer that compartmentalized, but it's pretty recent, right? And it's
That's
just kind of I
interesting.
just kind of stumbled into it, not without the foresight to do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm definitely in this phase in my life right now, where it is very much about like I don't know. It's kind of this I don't know
Mhm.
phase, and
Yeah,
like there's all these different things out here that I'm like this is interesting. This is interesting. There's
yeah,
this kind of like vague sense that they're connected in some way,
uh,
and I'm kind of wondering about like okay, so what's the process here? How's this going to process? Is this going to like just is not knowing just going to be the norm, or do
mhm.
things at some point congeal and then you're like, oh, I think I actually kind of have a picture of
Yeah,
something that's going on here. And at least
yeah,
I've heard in other cases, I kind of feel like Daniel Thorson in his podcast,
mhm.
I've heard him kind of say like, oh, I think I've kind of figured this out now. I mean,
uh,
and it's kind of, it almost sounds kind of like simplistic, or
uh,
reductive to say that.
yeah,
But it seems like you're kind of in a similar place as far as
mhm.
not that you've figured everything out, but it seems like at least as far as the thing you're doing, the picture's clearer, or things are kind of like more, um, I don't know,
Yeah.
crystallized.
Yeah, it's interesting that you listen to that podcast, because I think at the beginning of that podcast I talked about how I was in a very transition kind of distillatory phase of
Yep.
my life,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
was, uh, and it can be difficult, but I think the not knowing space is a very good space to be in,
Hmm.
because that's the space of a lot of potential, a lot of creativity, um, and and even now, so where I'm not so much in that phase anymore, but I think I should remind myself that I shouldn't I shouldn't hold too tightly to any okay,
Sure.
now this worldview is clicking, so I'm going to go with it. Well, I shouldn't hold it too tightly, because
Yeah.
I should be open to I should be open to further evolution.
Gotcha.
But it's not, but I'm definitely not, so you're probably familiar with like the progress of insight maps, Daniel
Yep.
Lerman talks about it a lot.
Yep.
there's kind of a parallel there, right? Because you go through this dissolution phase, the dark night,
Yeah.
and then you eventually get to this place of equanimity. And I think if I don't know how well that map, because that's a very kind of specific progressive insight map, and I don't know
Hmm.
how, but it seems to map. I feel like it maps pretty well onto life stages as well.
I know
Um,
I've kind of thought that a little bit too. Yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, maybe you
Um,
should talk a little bit more about that, because that's
uh-huh.
definitely of interest to me right now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, if I were to map my life situation onto that map, I would say it's kind of an equanimity type of phase,
Mm,
where I don't have this kind of underlying drive to I don't have this existential angst that I need to get to the bottom of something. Like
gotcha.
that's just not really
Yeah.
there anymore.
Hmm.
And it definitely was there before. So there's not the fire under my butt to like, discover the secrets of the universe. It's more of like, I feel like it's a little bit more of a flow where, I'm interested in stuff, but it's a more kind of playful. It's not a dependent interest. It's not conditional on finding the answer, I guess.
Gotcha.
And so I think I'm pretty comfortable with kind of some ambiguity. And it's interesting too, like a lot of like certain philosophical questions, like for a while, the mind body problem just consumed me. I was thinking about that all the time, sensing into it in my meditation practice. And now I'm just like, like, and maybe that's not a good thing. I don't know,
That
but
sounds very equanimity to me. If
right. Yeah. But it's
you
more of like,
shrug.
I'm not going to, or more to this discovery that I'm not going to find an analytical solution to that that's going to
Hmm.
satisfy me. So it's more of like sensing into it. Right. So it's just kind of more gentle and more subtle. Like, I'm walking down the road or walking through my field, and I'm just kind of sensing into, this kind of mysterious, arising of consciousness and connectivity with, mind, body, environment, like all of that is just, it's just more of like sensing and kind of resting into that mystery, but without any kind of, notion that I'm going to solve something.
It's a very, very different way to approach, like, I mean, it is a way to kind of operate, right? It is a kind of way to say, like, okay, here's what's happening, here's what I'm going to
Mhm.
do now, right? And it's a very different way to
Mhm.
approach it than I'm sure we were both kind of brought up to do, in a sense, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is I've also become much more, I would say, interested in just kind of learning how to like do things with my hands, like learning how to
Mm,
grow things, learning how to build, like just build things like chicken coop or hoop house,
hmm.
fix stuff around the house, like. And so there's on one hand like less drive to discover the secrets of the universe and more drive just to like really become intimate with my environment and
Yeah,
to build and create something.
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of compare, I guess, the stages I've been going through. I kind of
Mhm.
had I mentioned before we started, I had kind of my like a peak experience doing meditation, which kind of really flipped things around for me. And there was a
Yeah.
long period where it's just questioning everything. It's
Yeah.
why am I doing this? What are my motivations for doing this?
Yeah.
Because my previous way of doing things was just like, okay, this isn't working. And so
Mhm.
I went through a period where I dropped everything. I'm like, I
Yeah.
don't trust my reasons for doing anything.
Uh-huh.
And I just was very, very inactive, just full of doubt.
Yeah.
And I am now getting to this phase where I can feel this thing rising where it's like, okay, there's interest. I have interest in things,
Yeah.
and that feels good enough,
Nice.
and I'm
Yeah.
just going to kind of follow that,
Yeah. I think that's a
So,
great place to be. I mean, it's funny how analogous different kind of systems are. I mean, you can also relate this to this idea of modernity, postmodernity, and metamodernity, right?
mhm,
Modernity, is characterized by having a grand narrative that we believe in, and it's the grand narrative is rationality and science and progress, right?
mhm,
Then postmodernity is kind of questioning all of those things and
yeah,
questioning these grand narratives, questioning the language, questioning your positionality, And metamodernity is like, okay, like I feel like I've done enough of that. But we can't just swim in this kind of multi-perspectival madness. We have to like, survive as a civilization,
Hmm.
because we're facing a lot of existential crises. And so how can we be kind of self-aware of these narratives, but use them and kind of play with them, like be creative again, in a slightly more kind of self-aware, earnest irony type of sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it can look, I mean, and that maybe that's the difference. You're kind of describing before that you are in a place where there isn't some burning desire. You're kind of chill with what you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
but it's different than maybe the dogma that came before, in the sense that, like you say, you hold it lightly. You acknowledge that
Yeah.
it's a perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
that perhaps that perspective may have to be traded out for another perspective as the need
Yeah.
arises.
Yeah. I think so. I think so. And I think it's not, in some ways it's cyclical or spiral, in the sense that you're still, I feel like I've gone through a lot of evolution just in the last year, even though I've kind of been on this track. My kind of heightened interest in localism and homesteading and things like that, and permaculture is fairly new, and I feel like it continues to evolve, and so it's interesting that I'm hoping I never get to a place where it becomes stagnant or it becomes like dogmatic, right?
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
and so I hopefully it's a process that just goes on forever, or as long as you live, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is something I've related before, is that that's kind of what my art career became.
Hmm.
When you first start making art, you're like, "Oh, this is my chance to kind of step out
Yeah.
of the system and like do my own thing." But it's
Hmm.
very easy for you to create a new dogma, and it has its own rules and own strictures and things like that.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so it's kind of interesting that I feel, even though I'm doing less art now,
Hmm.
my life feels more artistic. It has more of that
Hmm.
sense of being artistic, um,
Yeah.
even having stepped away. So
So you're doing less art, but you're being art.
yeah,
You're
yeah, that's
enacting
kind of,
art.
I'm enacting art. Yeah, that's kind of the
Yeah.
feel. So that's kind of
Uh,
a good theme for, I think, for the podcast, and hopefully something
mhm.
I can start communicating more.
Nice.
So I want to hear from you more of like, I want to hear the story of the decision to kind of take on the homesteading, to make that leap, because that
Yeah.
is like a big step to take, to commit to something like that, as far as going to a specific place. I don't know if you acquired some land specifically to do this, or there's some land
Mhm.
already there, but I guess kind of explain that.
Yeah, that was also a process. So we happened to move to this area, Western North Carolina,
Mm,
Appalachia State, because my wife got a tenure track position here, and so I followed her. Um, and being here, and being with this Department of Sustainable Development, which I think I just realized that a lot of their values aligned more with my values than my previous department that I
hmm,
was associated with, and I was still doing a postdoc at the time. And so I started thinking more and more about taking things like ecological um, matters much more seriously.
hmm,
Um, as well as slowly kind of rejecting, I would say, the neoliberal paradigm,
hmm.
which I think I kind of had for a while. And it was kind of a return as well. Like when I was in high school, it was I was also very I was very similar to where I am now, but I think now I'm more sophisticated about it. I was a very naive version of myself in high school, and
Okay.
then I rejected that naive version. Went into kind of the technocratic neoliberal track, and then rejected that again.
You mean in the sense that you're kind of meditating then, or were you also kind of like interested in?
Yeah, so in high school, I was meditating. I was taking psychedelics. I had some pretty profound experiences growing up. My dad was part of the Native American Church, so I was part of some of those ceremonies. Um, and then I just, by the time I was like 16, 17, I was just really kind of influenced by kind of the psychedelic hippie scene. My parents were hippies, actually. They
Hmm.
met on a commune. So I was really discovering that a lot of the 60s culture type stuff I was really enamored by. Um, and and then I went to an alternative high school, where the teacher is like, he was, his favorite authors were Buckminster Fuller and Ken Wilber. And so you can imagine what that high school was like, right?
Yeah.
And so that was great. And I feel like I had kind of a personal creative renaissance. I was in drama.
Mm.
I just feel like I thrived there. And then I went to college and I started kind of having a dissolution, I think, where I just started kind of, again, having like emotional, psychological challenges, a lot of cognitive dissonance. And it eventually landed me, long story short, it landed me in kind of an economics kind of track. And then I wavered, went to geography for my master's, and then back to economics for a PhD. And so, and fell out of meditation as well, but was an active Baha'i. It's very nonlinear in many ways.
That's life, right?
Yeah, it's life. And so now coming back, it's like it's interesting that a lot of things have come full circle. The interest in meditation, consciousness, as well as kind of the worldview that I had in high school. That was, but I would say again, it's much less naive now.
Hmm.
It's more informed. I have much greater set of life experiences, and I've seen other perspectives. I've digested other perspectives, and so I think it's much more mature now. But yeah, going back to like how I got to homesteading, I started. We were doing the Both End podcast. Jared and I, and
Hmm.
we were interviewing a lot of like kind of meta modern kind of sense making type community people, and some of those strands that we just found out were kind of the bioregional scene. Joe Brewer was really influential for me. I'm not sure if you know. Um,
No, I need to follow. I just kind of recently heard about bioregionalism, so that's like
yeah,
a thread I need to follow up on. Yeah.
nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we interviewed him. That it was a very very influential, probably the most influential kind of in it for me, that interview that we had. And kind of simultaneously, I was also being starting to be influenced by the localists on Twitter. So like
Yeah.
it's neo localism, kind of new localism is Nassim Taleb is kind of a
Yep.
exemplar of that, and Joe
Yeah.
Norman is a big, very influential in that scene, and so that started also started to become quite influential for me, and I think at some point we were renting about 6 or 7 months in, we were going to buy a house, and it just kind of the thought crept in my mind that I was like, all of these things were kind of swirling in my mind. I was like, I'd like to get some land, and a lot of the houses we were looking at, and we almost closed on one, didn't have very much land, and I was like, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. My wife was at that time more interested in kind of like the interior of the house. I was more interested in like
But
the.
it wasn't the super concrete thing of like, I want a homestead. I've got the strong reason for it. It was more kind of like like I want some land and a little
Yeah, it
vaguer.
wasn't concrete at that time. It was just kind of like,
Yeah.
yeah, I think I'd kind of like some land, but if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. And
Hmm.
then we just happened to find this place within our budget, on 5 acres, and the interior is pretty decent as well. So my wife liked it. And my wife grew up on a farm, so she's really, I think, grown into like loving having land as well. And then so once we closed, and then all of a sudden it all kind of clicked, and I started reading permaculture material, and everything just kind of like snapped together, I
Hmm.
would say. And this was, we moved here right at the start of the pandemic, and so I think everything, many things kind of consolidated in a way of like, oh, and so part of what I do on Twitter is kind of thinking out loud, and
Yeah.
it's evolving my own thought
It's
process,
a
and so
good
a
way
lot
to
of
use it, I think.
what's that?
It's a good way to use it, I think.
Yeah, and then you get feedback, both
Hmm.
positive and negative, and
Hmm.
so that's, I think, a really interesting part of it as well. But yeah, just a lot of my thinking started revolving around the need to, and we're also thinking about like decentralization, and thinking about kind of like what is the ideal society or civilization, and so it all just kind of clicked, and I started just really thinking about the relationships between kind of sense of place, sustainability, resilience, regeneration, and became more convinced that, kind of a, decentralized, local, bioregional, circular economies are something that we should move towards,
Yeah.
as well as networked, as well as kind of the meta modern layer of like collective intelligence and personal development. And, all of that stuff, I didn't emphasize, I stopped emphasizing so much, but I've come back to it. And it's like, okay,
Hmm.
all of these things need to come together.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting. Maybe it'd be interesting for us just to talk about, for people that aren't aware, just talk a little bit about localism.
Hmm.
And then you also, the last discussion I saw you at the Stoa, you talked about
Hmm.
like cosmo-localism, which I think is a
Yeah.
really cool way of thinking about like how the internet interfaces with like the localism. So maybe you can just
Right.
do like cliff notes about localism, and then
Mhm.
kind of talk about the cosmo-localism, and maybe we can talk about metamodernism too a little bit, how those things kind of work together.
Sure. Yeah. So, so localism is how most of our ancestors lived most of their lives, right? And so, I think what we're talking about is a new localism, right?
Hmm.
It's different in the way that, like, so it's not a return, to it's not running back the clock.
Yeah.
I would say it's bringing forth the wisdom of the past into the present. So, there's many angles to talk about localism. One is this notion of scale, and like the lens of scale is kind of underemphasized in like
Hmm.
things like policy discussions, and even like kind of political polarization. If, so in my mind, if you get the scale right, if you're cultivating kind of strong communities, where people are interdependent, for life, and they're more in touch with their sources of livelihood, for their survival. There's just less political polarization. A lot of the kind of the left and right issues, not all of them, but I think a lot of them become less relevant. And so like people, I think, kind of confuse localism as like, is this like a right wing thing or a left wing thing? And it's like, well, it's really kind of both and neither. You have
Yeah.
kind of trads who are, you know, really attracted to localism, and you have,
Now explain what trads are, because you've mentioned this before, and I'm like, I don't understand that term. What's a
well,
trad?
it's kind of a meme, but it's a general. I would say there's a lot of people who, are more on the right wing, or maybe that's not even fair, the conservative wing, who are kind of like, man, modernity really sucks, and even like large corporations, and really suck as well. So it's not like George Bush conservatism, and we really need to get back to basics.
Yeah.
And we need to like start growing our own food again, because there's a lot of discussion, in that sphere of like, you know just all of the bad diet, and all of the ill health consequences, and so I think there's a growing interest in things like permaculture, but as well, I don't know if you're familiar with the meme of like cottage core.
I looked it up
Uh,
because of your last discussion too.
yeah,
So yeah, I do know
right,
about
right,
that now. Yeah.
right. And so and so there's a kind of like this, I think, longing to simplify your life, and make your life, for people to make their life more meaningful, and more tangible, and more connected to the land and their neighbors, and not to be so atomized, and
Yeah.
I think that aesthetic in particular is very attractive to people. um, but you also have kind of radical left anarchists also really interested in localism, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It takes on different flavors, right? So on the trad side, I think they're more attracted to this notion of distributism, um, which is still kind of private ownership, but broadly distributed,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of like village economies.
So it's
Um,
more like there's a neighborhood, and the neighborhood's owned by the people in the neighborhood type thing. Is that kind of a good example of that?
yeah,
But
but
there's
the
still
neighbors.
ownership.
Yeah, so but the neighbors are still really close. There's
Yeah.
still mutual aid, and there's a lot of like helping your neighbor. Like your neighbor is building a barn, the whole neighborhood shows up to help him.
Mm-hmm.
So that ethic is very strong. But it's a little bit different than I think the left version, which is more of a mutualist, of like collective ownership,
Mm-hmm.
democratizing the means of production, things like that. But my point of view, and why I'm kind of ambivalent here is that the nice thing about localism is that you can have many different types of communities, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you're not. It's kind of the anti-homogenization, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
can have you can have the Amish community down the street and the kind of the left commune down the
Mm-hmm.
street, and and they can interact and with each other, but they can also kind of leave each other alone a little bit as well,
Yeah.
and have enough relationship to keep the peace, things like that.
Do
And
you
so
ever do you follow like strong towns very much?
I've heard of strong towns. My friend recommended strong towns, and I haven't really dug into it, but I want to.
So that was my kind of entry into localism, even though I don't know
Yeah,
if they identify that way. But
yeah,
one of the things they make like a very big emphasis on, and it's like kind of written into their DNA, is
hmm,
that just that they want to have nothing to do with like being partisan or politics. That it is
yeah,
very much about like just people figuring out how to like have strong communities.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but anyway, they're
That's very much in
super
line.
interesting to look at. They're very much looking at like the economics of
Right.
cities and towns and stuff. But that was
Hmm.
the big change for me after like 2016 election with like Bernie
Hmm.
Sanders. I was like Bernie Sanders,
Yeah.
and then Chuck Marone, who's the kind of founder of Strong Towns, he wrote this thing about like, yeah, it probably doesn't matter that much who the president of the
Hmm.
United States is, and that was the
Yeah.
big turn where it's like, okay, I'm just
Yeah.
focusing on like my own community, my own neighborhood, my own life, and it's
Yeah.
just gotten deeper since then. But anyway,
Yeah, no, I mean, I voted for Bernie Sanders, but my theory, I actually had some arguments with one guy in particular who was very kind of like pure, very strong Bernie, and was criticizing people in the sense making space for not being more vocal advocates of it. But my theory of change, I think, is kind of like what you're describing. Of well, that would be, a lot of Bernie's values align with mine, but my theory of change is really not national politics.
yeah,
I just don't at this point. I just see too many headwinds there, and so what can we do? Well, we can, start building communities from the ground up, and this gets into the cosmo-local part and connecting with each other, right?
yeah,
And sharing information, sharing insight, doing what we're doing right now, having a podcast from across the country, right?
yeah,
Um, and so that's I would say technically that's a cosmo-local vision where you're still having a lot of cultural exchange, probably much more than in the past. So it's not in my version of it, it's not an isolationist vision at all.
yeah,
But so it's another way to put it is that you're you're localizing a lot of your production, but you're planetizing. I don't even want to say globalizing because people associate that with globalism, and that's not
yeah,
what I'm talking about. You're planetizing kind of cultural exchange and mutual support.
yeah,
Um, and cosmo-local in particular has to do with kind of a new movement or a new set of technologies where you have kind of a set of open source kind of designs and technology that people are contributing to that are generally like modular, can be adapted easily to like a region's kind of local resource base, things like that. And so, but it's almost the same concept, but not quite. It's very so. An example of this is like the open source ecology project.
hmm.
Marcin, forget his last name, and there's many other projects like this where basically in this project in particular, like his group is developing like 50 machines that he calls a civilizational starter kit that
Interesting.
and he's posting all of the designs online. As far as I know, a lot of other people are contributing to those designs, and people are, the idea is then you manufacture locally. Maybe at a community level, you have a community workshop space. Perhaps a machine or tool library, something like that, and you're adapting and you're applying, and then the new insights you get, you also upload that to kind of like the commons resource, right?
Yeah,
Um,
that's really
and
cool.
yeah, and I think that's really the way localism needs to go in order to be viable, because
Yeah,
if not, I just think if we don't have this this planetary interconnectedness, and we can get into bioregionalism in a bit, but it's kind of similar. I just think that as conditions become more difficult, I'm kind of a doomer in terms of like, climate change,
Yeah.
ecological degradation and collapse, as well as energy availability, which
Hmm.
I'm a little pessimistic about. You know, in order to not devolve into a new dark ages, and don't get me wrong, there were some good things about the dark ages. It's had a
Yeah.
little bit of a bad rap, but not devolve into kind of a new kind of neo-feudal situation where you have new like wars over territory breaking out and new empires trying to be built.
Yeah.
In order to avoid kind of the really dark parts of our past, like we need to embrace um, localism itself needs to embrace a planetary vision.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of have like two kind of thoughts along those lines. And one is like, again, it seems like this, it kind of follows, obviously, it's kind of like a meta modern step, right?
Hmm.
That localism could look very much like going backwards to this regressive thing,
Hmm.
but with the correct sophistication, it is actually like, oh, this is like a step forward, right?
Yeah.
And it's something again that's more fluid, where it doesn't need to be this like dogma of a culture, but the
Hmm.
cultures can be like, here's what's working, you can adapt, adjust,
Yeah.
um, the other thing that really appeals to me about cosmo-localism is I feel like it demonstrates a maturation of our like relationship to like information technology, like the internet.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
as far as, I mean, you probably
Absolutely.
remember like the early aughts, just the kind of like utopianism that came along with the internet, right?
Right. Hmm.
And now there's just a feeling to it where it's like, okay, this is like a tool, this is like a functional thing, obviously very extremely powerful,
Yeah.
but it feels there's something a little bit less sexy about it, or um, obviously there's still lots of things that can go wrong, but
Right.
I like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's been appropriated by the way I would put it is it's been appropriated by capitalist incentives to for example, most social media platforms are ad based, so it's incentivizing clicks, it's incentivizing engagement, right, and it's incentivizing polarization
Hmm.
as well, right. The news stories that get the most attention usually are the most polarizing ones. And all of this makes a lot of money for
Hmm.
for corporations. And so I think that's the utopian kind of visions of the internet of the past didn't take into account how it would be co-opted by
Of course, yeah.
by financial interests, frankly. And
You,
and so I the yeah and so the one reason I like this vision is it's kind of taking over the means of this production in a way, to put
yeah,
it in a Marxist sense.
sure.
And it's and there's a lot of kind of technologies that I'm finding I find really promising. Like there's, for example, Holochain, which is all about I won't pretend to just understand that much of it. We actually interviewed a guy who's associated with it, but um, it's about creating kind of like a peer-to-peer kind of a platform for peer-to-peer interactions. So there's no kind of like centralized database or blockchain, and
Hmm.
it's meant to facilitate like mutual aid, kind of microcurrencies, things of that nature, as well as the cosmo-local stuff. Somebody who speaks, who is kind of who my first reference for the cosmo-local stuff or the commons is Michelle Bowens,
Okay.
and he has the P2P peer-to-peer foundation, and his whole point is that peer-to-peer and this notion of the commons represents an alternative economic model that um, is very different than capitalism, but it's not like similar to communism in the 20th century. It's much more decentralized, but it does have some similarities to like the old kind of like guilds of the past, and we've heard of like the commons in Europe that were
Hmm.
enclosed for to bring in workers for capitalist production, things like that. And so that's, I'm very hopeful about those technologies, but there's a lot of, really distorted incentives. Right now, I'd say the internet is not in a good place, and social media is not in a good state.
Like the understatement of the century.
Exactly, it's a medium for manipulation and the spread of conspiracy theories,
Yeah,
and
extraction.
polarization. All of this stuff, and it doesn't. I don't think it has to be that way.
Did you ever read Bill Hamilton's Saints and Psychopaths?
I never read it, although I know that both Kenneth Folk and Daniel Ingram, that was their teacher.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. He's
yeah,
kind of this
so
interesting character
secondhand.
that keeps like showing up. Like Shinzen Yam
Uh,
was also friends with him. But anyway,
mm,
kind of one of the themes is like in his spiritual journey, he ends up joining kind of these different spiritual communities or making relationships with different spiritual characters that turn out to be like psychopaths.
yeah, yeah,
And
mhm,
it's always it's the flashy stuff, right? It's always like the
yeah,
really flashy, interesting stuff. And kind
uh,
of at the end of the book, he's kind of like, the reason I ended up going to Buddhism was because it was the really boring stuff. And like the boring stuff
yeah,
was where all the powerful stuff was.
yeah,
And that's kind of like something I'm using as a little bit of a compass nowadays in my
mhm,
life is like the powerful stuff is kind of hidden behind like the really boring veneer. But anyway, that kind of feels like what you're describing with like like the way the internet will interface or could
mhm,
interface with cosmo-localism is
yeah,
that the internet's probably going to be a little not quite as exciting and flashy, but
uh-huh.
it could be very super powerful. I don't know, weird metaphor, but that's what popped in my mind
Yeah,
as I
no,
was
that's an
thinking
interesting.
about that.
That's a metaphor I'll have to think about, or that's an analogy I'll have to think about. Um, yeah, I mean, you mentioned that you got into pragmatic dharma. Their whole thing is, don't worry about, these really kind of flowery belief systems, or, don't even worry about kind of states of consciousness. Just focus on the basics, mechanics. Daniel Ingram is like, note, note, note.
Yeah, yeah,
Know your
exactly.
experience. Don't stop to psychoanalyze it or anything. Just keep noting all the way through. Uh, yeah, I think so. Because I think another concept that is part of this whole conversation is this concept of degrowth, and simplifying our lives. So less waste, right? Trying to create a circular economy. So you're reusing materials, recycling, you know fertility back in the land with regards to agriculture, and just using less stuff, building things to last. And so, I think for some people, probably that seems like kind of a downer, because you're not getting kind of all of the fancy new consumer items necessarily. You're getting things that are functional, but it's definitely a kind of a minimum viable tech sensibility, right? Like if you
Yeah.
can, if you can, if you need to mow your grass, and if you can do it with a scythe instead of a mower, use a scythe. Maybe it'll take a little longer, maybe it won't. If you get good with a scythe, it's pretty efficient. Of course, there's more physical, manual labor involved, but hey, you don't need a gym membership anymore, right? Like the absurdity of modernity is that we have these like we work at a computer all day, we eschew, we develop technology that is labor saving, and then we go to the gym.
Go to the
Like,
gym. Yeah.
it's just, to me, it's just kind of absurd. And so it's yeah, and so in many ways it's kind of radically simplifying our lives, but also hopefully making them more meaningful, and so it's degrowth in terms of material throughput, but it's growth in terms of quality of life.
Yeah, that's what I was going to
Yeah,
ask you about, and I think that's kind of where it like interfaces with like the metamodernism stuff, right? As far as yeah, like quality of life really can be decoupled from like consumerism, and this is something I never realized until I started having experiences with meditation and
yeah,
realized like, oh my gosh, you can have very, very satisfying experiences with very, very simple things, if you can get your
yes.
brain in order, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for me, just speaking for myself, I mean, so meditation definitely helped with that. It made me more content with the present moment and not needing to grasp, but also, embracing again physical labor, using my hands.
Mm.
I try and every day, I try and do a little bit of work. Physical work every day. I don't always do it, but I try, and that also has a very grounding effect, I would say, of like, and a very satisfying effect. Whereas,
Yeah.
a day after I've done an hour or so of physical labor, I'm usually more content, I think. Um,
Do you find that there's part of that contentment comes from like the multi-layered aspect of the type of labor you're doing? Because obviously you're using your body and your
yeah.
hands, but there's the specific environment you're doing it in
Uh,
that's probably, beautiful. There's the purpose with what you're doing, so it isn't just a treadmill, right?
yeah.
But it's many things all at once going on.
Yeah, exactly. So, some tasks are just kind of, there's kind of two types of physical labor. There's one where I am using my brain and I'm solving problems. So like, when we were building our chicken coop or our hoop house, I'd never done that before. I've never really built anything or used my hands before. I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
And so just the process of figuring things out is very engaging. But there's also like one thing I did this winter is I started digging out a pond. And that was just day after day for an hour
Yeah.
or two. I was just digging with a shovel,
Just by
uh,
hand.
just by hand. Yeah, and it's just it's very repetitive, but so in that case, it was nice to just kind of turn my mind off, right,
Hmm.
and just kind of have that rhythmic, kind of repetitive. You could say it's almost meditative. Of course,
Sure.
I was often listening to podcasts and stuff, so it's still stimulating my mind. But it was that in conjunction with kind of like this kind of physical repetitive thing, and so both of those are satisfying. In both the kind of problem solving, but also just kind of like, I like repetitive manual labor. I just enjoy it. In certain
Yeah.
doses, not like all day every day, but in certain doses, it's nice.
Yeah. So anything else? 'Cause you're saying meditation, manual labor. Are there any other things that you feel kind of like help to serve that need of kind of well-being without consumption, I guess?
This is probably not a good answer, and it's not something I would necessarily recommend. But I've also found nicotine very useful. Nicotine
That's probably
lozenges.
a less popular answer to
It's a
that.
form of so it's definitely consumption.
Yeah.
I picked up a kind of a little cigarette habit in my early 30s,
Okay.
and then I switched to lozenges, and now I have a lozenge habit. Um, but I like them a lot. Nicotine is a pretty magical drug.
Yeah. Hey, that's cool.
Not that I would recommend this to the audience to introduce a new addiction into your life.
Maybe it's just a matter of, in some cases, finding the right thing to consume and just like stick
Yeah,
with that. If you
yeah.
find something that
I
works,
see
stick
it
with
as
it.
kind of like coffee. It's
Yeah.
kind of like caffeine. It's if you decouple the nicotine from the harmful effects of cigarettes, I see it as
Hmm.
just kind of another kind of another kind of stimulant as coffee.
Yeah.
Except that I think it's better than coffee in some ways.
Well, I grew up Mormon, and the one thing I didn't pick up after I left Mormonism was smoking. So
That's
I,
probably good. Yeah. Again, I'm not recommending it, but it did. It one thing that it does for me is it makes me. So I have I'm using lozenges right now. It makes me. I'm more socially awkward when I don't have nicotine
interesting.
lozenges.
Yeah.
It kind of calms my mind down and makes it sharper at the same time. So
Hmm.
it stops it from kind of spinning in loops and kind of getting out of the moment. But it also kind of helps me focus in and be very engaged with, let's say, a conversation or something like that. So
Interesting.
anyway, that's my So I propose these very wholesome things. Meditation, big advocate. Manual labor, big advocate. But that's my less wholesome.
I'm buying stocks and nicotine lozenges after this. That's
Right. That's the third leg of my three-legged stool.
will make a chart with that.
Yeah.
So you said you're kind of like a lapsed meditator, like lately. I'm kind of interested.
Yeah.
I've kind of noticed this thing that as I've been doing more meditation, that I definitely find some value in just like taking a break. I think initially
Yeah.
when I started, it's like, oh, I got to be consistent, blah, 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 blah. And
Mhm.
there's the further I go, the more I'm like, yeah, I'm going to take a break right now.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something similar or if it's something else going on, but maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, so one change that happened is again like I'm just not. I don't feel the as much existential need to meditate.
Hmm.
I feel like I went through some kind of process. I have no idea where I am on any map or anything like that. But some kind of cycle I feel like completed, where suddenly like it's kind of like something that's interesting, and kind of restorative to do, but it's not something that I need to do, or else I'm going
Hmm.
to like go nuts.
Yeah. And you
Right?
don't feel like you're chasing some sort of like progress on this like fourth
No.
path model or something.
No, I'm not chasing any kind of new awakening at the moment. Maybe that'll change in the future.
Yeah.
But one other thing I would say is that one part of the kind of the meditation I developed system that I developed for myself was self inquiry, and kind of combining self inquiry with mindfulness. So
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe
what
you can
that
describe a little bit. You said you kind of
yeah.
developed a system. I'd be interested in hearing like what your technique is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So basically, and again, it's not. I wouldn't say it's an original system. I think all of the parts and mechanics I picked up from other people,
Yeah.
I developed a system for myself that I haven't quite seen articulated in its fullness anywhere else.
Hmm.
And basically, in a nutshell, it's you know. So self inquiry can take many different forms. The classic self inquiry question is, "Who am I?" Right? It's
Hmm.
Ramana Maharshi. And something that always occurred to me is just I guess how my mind works. Is I was always like, what's the mechanics here? What's going on? And I think part of what people in that community would say is, well, it's to help you stop thinking. It's like, okay, well, that's something I can vibe with that. But one thing I noticed is that doing these kind of self inquiries, one thing you're doing is you're kind of turning the mindfulness around from kind of objects and awareness to the observer itself.
Hmm.
Right. So like the sense of self, the one who is doing the meditating, the one who is doing the noting or whatever technique. And so for example, I might be just doing some mindfulness practice, and then I might ask the question like, who is meditating, or what is aware? Who am I? Or where is the locus of attention? Something like that. And I notice that some new parts of my body light up, some new sensations light up, and that are associated with the sense of self. And so that might be like sensations in the eyebrows, or in the shoulders, and that changes, right? Like sense of self is
Hmm.
notoriously kind of slippery, right? Like
Yeah.
Robert Bea talked about, put it as like, it's probably a mistake to try and think of the sense of self as like a kink in the rug, and every time you push down that kink, it arises somewhere else, right? And
Hmm.
so it's not trying to like smash that kink down, but it's more of just kind of exploring, okay, like where is the sense of self right now? And it's all, and it's kind of a very spatial thing. Gary Weber was very influential for me here, and he's very interested. He's really into kind of self inquiry with like movement practices, right? And his whole thing is, one of his favorite inquiries is, where am I? So like actually a
Interesting.
very very physical location sense of like, where is the sense of self? Like you feel it. Can you locate it in physical space, right?
Hmm.
Um, but then when you can locate in physical space, then you can start applying mindfulness to those sensations, and you do that for a while, and then you notice after a while that a new sense of self kind of creeps up somewhere else, and then you,
Hmm.
you do the process again, and you iterate again and again. But one nice thing about that is that self inquiry is very amenable to just doing anywhere, any part of the day. You're driving. I mean, that is not where you're not like actively trying to solve a problem, but you're just like
Hmm.
driving down the street or walking, where it's not high cognitive requirement. You can be driving down the street and ask, who is driving? What is the way of driving? Where am I? All of these kind of type inquiry type questions.
Hmm.
Um, and or you're working outside, and it's like you can ask those questions again. And oftentimes for me at this point, because I've just done this for a while now, it stops being a very explicit question, and it's more of just kind of an intuitive shift of like shifting
Interesting.
into kind of like that inquiry state of mind, and that state of consciousness that I would say is more, you could describe it as more non-dual, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
um, and then part of the system, I was really influenced by one meditation teacher, who I actually was his student online for a while and had a problematic relationship with. So I don't want to mention his name or anything, but he
Okay.
had he had a mechanic or, like one that was really useful, where he alternated between what he called selfing mode and selfless mode. So selfing
Hmm.
mode is something like just repeating the sense, reifying the sense of self very strongly. So like I, me, mine, this is my experience, even repeating my name, and just really feeling into the sense of self.
Hmm.
And then switching and noticing the selfless mode of like, there is the scene, there is looking, but there's nothing, but there's actually, the sense of the observer looking is not necessary.
So
Seeing
you
is,
really get the contrast, right? You're
yeah,
firing up one thing. It's almost like tuning a guitar, right? When you're tuning a
exactly.
guitar, that like you go
Yeah.
with the extremes.
It's
Yeah.
emphasizing the contrast. Exactly.
Ah,
And
yeah.
so I wrote a paper about this in the side view a couple of years ago, but basically, filling out the system, it's, alternating between questioning what, where, who, all of these things, to what I would call the kind of the self mode of like, or you know, the way I put it was like the affirmation mode, the affirmation of self, mine, me, my, to kind of the selfless mode, which is again like there is seeing, there's hearing, and then I differentiated between, kind of first, second, and third person of that. So the third person, I'm trying to even remember. Relook at my own article,
You need
but
a chart. I need a
but
chart
basically
for this.
differentiating between like you can affirm that just like there is seeing, so that's the
Hmm.
second person, like active, like there's a
Yeah.
relationship between the seer and the seen, there is seeing, to something more like there is the seen, uh, to something like seen, just seen, right?
Hmm.
And those might seem kind of trivial differences, but those subtleties are important, I would say, when you're kind of deep in meditation, because the
Hmm.
difference between there is seeing, okay, but there's not necessarily a seer, there's just the process of seeing.
Hmm.
Two, there is the scene, there's actually just the scene, like there's just that tree, that's it. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
kind of like you're absorbing, another way to put it is that, you're kind of absorbing into the environment. And
Yeah. You're moving kind of the separation, right? And it's just
yeah,
about the object.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, the
Yeah.
whole
Yeah. That makes
system is
sense.
all about removing, uh, temporarily, the separation between subject and object. I mean, that's
Yeah.
basically what this whole system, and contrast and iteration, and switching is all about, is exploring the sense of self, but doing it to dissolve kind of that sense of separation until
This
you get
is
to the point
cool.
where it becomes non-dual.
Yeah, this is stuff I'm doing a little bit of right now in my practice. So this is interesting to hear some little some more specific. I'm much more less organized with how I'm doing it.
Right.
I'm just
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah. I'm
playing
usually
around.
too. Like when
Yeah,
I wrote that article, it comes across as very systematic, but when I'm actually meditating, I don't have a plan beforehand. I just kind of follow my intuition
mm,
and explore whatever seems interesting, and it's usually very unstructured and very informal.
yeah,
And yeah,
yeah. Meditation. That's when it really gets interesting and fun. Is when you get to kind of the creative point with it, where
yeah,
you're like, okay,
yeah,
I'm just gonna try things, and let's go
exactly,
this way. And
exactly.
yeah,
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 that's where the magic starts happening. I feel like
yeah.
is you're comfortable enough with the techniques that you have in your tool set that you
Hmm.
can then just kind of explore,
Hmm.
just like you said, and follow your intuition.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's not helped me much lately. Like the last week or two has really been, I go through these phases where it's just every session is just me falling asleep the whole time. And so
right.
I'm in one of those phases right now.
Right, right, and that's true. I mean, I think that's fine too. I mean, often what I found is that, just trying to maintain mindfulness and,
Mm,
doing these subtle inquiries throughout the day was, usually it helped my night. If I had a night practice, then, I usually hit the ground running a little bit more.
hmm,
But, sometimes, I sit down at night and I'm just like falling asleep. I'm like, okay, that's fine. I'm just gonna go to sleep.
falling asleep. Yeah.
And not being so strict, but, yeah, for me, it's just kind of like, you know, the real practice is integrating into your daily life,
Hmm,
right? And
yeah.
and that's part of like the decompartmentalization thing I talked about before, where the more that you integrate it into your life, the more, at least in my experience, the daily sit can be kind of a supplement to that, but it's not strictly necessary.
Yeah. So I was wondering if we could loop back a little bit. I do want to cover bioregionalism since
Mm-hmm.
I'm just starting to kind of inform myself about it, but it's not really clear to me. I hear bioregionalism and it kind of just sounds like another word for localism. So maybe you
Yeah.
could help distinguish between those two things, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, so it's interesting. This is something that I've been puzzling over for, I'd say, the last 6 months or so, and I think
Hmm.
culminated in that talk at the Stoa, where they're definitely different sociological movements, I would say.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
come from different traditions, right?
Hmm.
So people, well-known people in the bioregionalist movement are like Gary Snyder and Peter Berg, people like that, and then more recently like Daniel Christian Wall and Joe Brewer. And they really emphasize a number of things. One is ecological consciousness. So a kind of non-duality in an ecological sense.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Another is
Like, do you mean when you talk about that is the kind of the sense of there's not really a boundary between us and our ecology, that it's essentially the same system? Is that kind of the
Yeah,
idea
yeah.
there?
So it's kind
Yeah.
of like rediscovering our interdependence with ecology
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
rewilding ourselves,
Hmm.
both physically and in terms of our consciousness. And so, dissolving this kind of modernist separation between humans and nature. So that's a big part. And another part is kind of rediscovering. There's a strong emphasis on kind of learning from indigenous culture or indigenous
Hmm.
cultures, and also this notion of decolonization of both of our minds, but also physically. But the bioregional part comes in of it definitely is a sense of place, but it's acknowledgement that oftentimes bioregions make the most sense in terms of organizing human society and culture. So designing around landscapes just makes a lot of sense for many different reasons. So one, and bioregion, how they're defined is fuzzy. They
Hmm.
can be defined different ways, and they're not just defined ecologically; they're also defined culturally. But just an example is like you know living in a watershed, right? And if a watershed, one half of the watershed is in one jurisdiction, and another is in another jurisdiction, and they have different laws, and you have upstream polluters and downstream people who are affected by it. So there's externalization of costs. It's basically a recognition that like no, we have to think that the scale of a bioregion is a very coherent scale for living ecologically. Or in line with with the planet. Um, and one thing that I noticed is that that was kind of the movement that I was more interested in first, and then before localism, and then I got interested in localism, and it's definitely a different sociological movement. Again, I think again Nassim Taleb kind of popularized it, but a lot of I would say the kind of the modern godfather of localism is Wendell Berry. Um,
Okay.
and and Wendell Berry, he's a great writer. He's one of my favorite writers. But he talks a lot about he grew up on a Kentucky small farm. Still lives there, and so he talks a lot about like what we've lost with modernity, like the sense of community, the sense of meaningfulness in our lives, being connected to the land, as well as like taking care of the land, soil preservation, things like that. And so it's not. So it's not as explicitly like talking about ecological consciousness and stuff like that, but it's implied. It's implicit,
Hmm.
I would say. And so
Yeah.
that was kind of like my insight. That I was like, hey, these movements are like not really talking to each other very much, but they should be because I think they have a lot to learn from each other. And one
Yeah.
way I connected them as well is that bioregions. So one notion, another framing of localism is this idea of minimum viable scale, meaning that you know, um, certain things in terms of governance or production have to be done at larger or smaller scales, but can you find the minimum viable scale?
So it's kind of like similar to like subsidiarity, like
Yeah,
that
yeah,
concept. Okay.
it's exactly that. It's exactly
Okay.
that. And one thing that was interesting to me is that bioregions is a very important scale, right? And so like some scales you can think about that I think are really important is the individual, the
Yeah.
internal ecology,
Yeah.
the household or family,
Hmm.
the household ecology. Then you have the village, and then you have the watershed, and then you have the larger bioregion, and then the planetary, right?
Interesting.
And so I just found that very interesting that these were two kind of movements that had a little bit of overlap, but really weren't talking to each other. And I was like, hey, I'm going to put my memetic mediator hat on and try and foster some dialogue between these movements. And I've had more or less more or less success. I think there's definitely there's been some friction in trying to like
Interesting.
connect these connect some of these players online, but I think it's gone okay.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Um, I'm surprised that there would be tension, but I guess there's like always cultural things and
Yeah, I mean, localists tend to be more trad,
yeah,
and bioregionalists tend to be more leftist. And so I would
yeah,
say that's a big cultural tension. Especially these days when there's just a lot of reactivity around like woke, anti-woke stuff like that. Um,
hmm,
and so there's definitely a lot of landmines
sure.
that you can step on.
Yeah. Is that, well, I don't know if I want to go down that rabbit hole.
Hmm.
No, that's interesting. I'm still just trying to like process kind of then the connection. You talk about minimum viable scale, and it seems to
Hmm.
me that something I'm trying to like, this is an idea that I'm not fully formed, but it seems like something that's kind of gone wrong with what we have now
Hmm.
is kind of like, I don't know, mixing those like trying to address different scales at like one scale at the different scale. I
Hmm.
get that's probably a horrible way to say it, but in the sense of
Hmm.
you talk about like the individual scale and how that's mostly happening at this very large global level that we're basically kind of plugging into, whatever the news feed or whatever that is.
Right.
I don't know. I'm just kind of like
Yeah, well,
that
it's
kind of,
a thought that you just provoked is, an example of this might be that you're seeking your satisfaction from external stimulus, from things outside of yourself, and then you start
yeah,
meditating and you realize that you can discover satisfaction just through your own mind, right? So
exactly. Yeah.
that's discovering minimum viable scale, right? It's like
Yeah.
like what you were pursuing at a larger scale actually is better pursued at a smaller scale.
Hmm.
But the caveat I always make here is that for some things, planetary is a minimum viable scale.
Yes.
So, for example, the example I think is going to be increasingly relevant is this climate refugees, right? Like,
Hmm.
there's projected to be hundreds of millions of climate refugees in the next few decades, mostly coming from the global south, who, by the way, contributed least to the global emissions, least to the problem. And so
Hmm.
I would say that this is not a problem that is localized to those communities that are losing losing their homes. This is a global, a planetary problem.
Hmm.
Other ones, obvious ones, nuclear proliferation.
Hmm.
I think you need some kind of global governance. Mind you, not global governance necessarily. Hopefully not,
Yeah.
actually. So
Yeah. Yeah.
hopefully it would be an emergent governance, not some kind of top-down totalitarian governance. Uh,
Hmm.
I'm very wary of that. Um, but so it's so the minimum viable scale, again, whether it's different scales of governance, different types of or supply chains, it is going to differ for different things, right? And so you have this idea of nested scales,
Yeah.
and a big challenge is finding coherence across these nested scales.
I was gonna ask you
Yeah,
about that. That seems
yeah,
like the big challenge there, right?
yeah,
Is
yeah. And there's
yeah.
people, especially in I would say the bioregional scene that are
Mhm.
working on this. So for example, somebody like Gregory Landua, he's part of the, I think it's the Region Network. I confuse all these names, but so he's really into kind of like the crypto, like potentials of like crypto technology and things like that to help facilitate this kind of multi-scale governance.
Interesting.
Especially like around landscapes. Joe Brewer talks about like creating kind of like bioregional networks at multiple scales. Yeah, maybe it'll come back to me. There's one more example I was going to give, but oh yes. There's also people. So have you heard of like Eleanor Ostrom and kind of commons based natural resource
I'm
management?
I'm familiar with her. I haven't like
Yeah.
read any of her stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so she talked about natural resource management, and she outlined like cultures throughout history, kind of independently evolved institutions, informal
Hmm.
institutions for managing common resources that were not necessarily tied to either state or like private corporations, and did very well. And she has
Hmm.
a set of principles that help enable that. But there's a whole set of people who are interested in kind of like mapping all of her principles to kind of like new types of technologies like the
Hmm.
blockchain and even like AI and things
Interesting.
like also things like smart contracts and quadratic voting and all of these kind of like new innovations and institutions that people are proposing, as well as like bringing in kind of a cybernetic component with like bringing in like Earth observatory systems to like monitor landscape health, but then feeding that information back and like to the ground, for communities to respond to. So yeah, so there's a lot of people that are aware of this challenge and are working on it.
That's interesting. And I guess
Yeah,
this kind of interfaces too with kind of these like game theory problems that are much discussed as far as
yeah,
if we're going to have all these little local, units, how to keep
yeah.
everyone from playing nicely and not, you
Yeah,
know,
that's a big challenge, and that's definitely something that I don't think that challenge should be underestimated. And I think that's also where, and this I talked about in the Stoa, is where kind of like metamodernism
hmm,
uh, comes in,
yeah,
right? Because
yeah,
I find that at least in terms of cultural theory, it's integral is in that space as well, but so maybe a bit of both of them. But in terms of cultural theory, in terms of like understanding personal development and where people are coming from, and how do you work with different perspectives to work together and create a civilization that works for everybody. There's a lot of thought and a lot of work that people is going into that, right? Not only that, of course, the game B people are
yeah,
talking a lot about this as well. Um, the sense making space broadly, like that's their jam, right?
yes, yes.
Um, and that's again, that's also why I think these different movements need to be talking to each other, because I think the sense making metamodern without this kind of foundation of localism, bioregionalism, I think it doesn't actually go anywhere. It's wheel spinning, right? It's not
Like
it's
it's a
not
little bit too
embodied enough.
it's a little too abstract, or it needs like
Yeah,
some
it's
sort.
too
Yeah,
abstract, and so you
yeah,
need you need both, right? You need
mm,
you need kind of these very grounded movements. But in order to address these issues that we're talking about, of like how do you get people to play nice with each other, communities to play nice with each other, and prevent, frankly, just you know, large scale, conflict. We need also to be thinking about cultural theory and
mm,
and and how do you create, as John Vervaeke says, ecologies of practice to to kind of create a new kind of metamodern religion, or set of religions that fulfill
yeah.
deep existential spiritual needs of people, as well. Because so there's like, you can have the physical infrastructure, but you also need kind of the psycho spiritual infrastructure as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that's been like weighing very heavily on my mind lately and I mean, I kind of have been using the word community lately, and I just think that's like kind of just almost a too technocratic word or whatever. But,
Right.
it is really religion, and what religion has done in the past is like what is needed to serve that function to tie people together. I mean, you can call
Yeah.
it churches, like,
Right. Yeah.
um,
I mean, we definitely, I think, a lot of localists are traditionalists as well in the religious sense, right? So
mhm,
like, you find like, like people who are, rediscovering like Catholic tradition or Orthodox tradition, like those two in particular seem to be very resonant. But there's a lot of, and I think for a lot of people, those will do just fine. But for a lot of kind of people who have kind of been disaffected from religion, have been secularized, it's more difficult to do that, right? And so for there, the big question that folks like John Vervaeke are working on is how do we create the religion of the future that incorporates all the skepticism of modernity, but still recognizes that we modernity threw the baby out with the bathwater, especially in terms of like things like ritual and tradition, and meaningfulness, right? Like how do we rediscover meaning in a very deep sense? And the metamodernists talk a lot about this too. Like, I mean that's a big part of what they're working on.
Awesome. Well, maybe that's a good place for us to leave off on that. That was a broad range of topics to go over.
Yeah.
I'm going to have a huge reading list based off of this discussion, but it's all like exciting stuff. So this is really exciting for me too, because this is just, I'm kind of on my own as I'm thinking through things, trying to create maps and try to connect stuff together. And it's fun to have a conversation and just hear like, okay, there's a lot of people are thinking the same things and putting things together in the same way. So
find the others; they're out there.
I know, yeah. That's what this is all about, right, man?
Yeah, all about. At the end of the day, it's all about connecting with people and forming these relationships, having these conversations. That realizing that we're not alone in our cognitive dissonance, but also realizing interesting new pathways to pursue.
Awesome. Well, thanks. This has been like super helpful and interesting to me. So I appreciate you spending a little bit of time, taking some time away from the hoop house to.
Well, it's nighttime, so it's all right.
It makes it easier.
Hoop house is already built.
Nice. All right, Jason. Thanks for hanging out with me.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed it a lot.
You've been listening to How to Be an Artist. To support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA.